The moment that changed everything. The morning at Harbor Brew had started like any other. The familiar hum of the espresso machine, the soothing scent of fresh coffee drifting through the air, and the comfortable chatter of regulars as they came and went. It was a place of solace for many in the small town, home away from home. For Olivia, managing this quaint cafe was more than just a job. It was a calling, a sanctuary for veterans who came in to find peace in the midst of their struggles. Olivia had worked tirelessly over the years to make the cafe a place where veterans could find comfort. Every Wednesday morning, the Veterans Coffee Hour had become a cherished tradition. It was her simple idea, born from the desire to give back to those who had sacrificed so much. For veterans like Ethan, it was a lifeline. He was no older than 30, yet the weight of his experiences seemed to age him beyond his years. He'd started coming in 2 years ago, and at first, he barely spoke. His German shepherd, Ranger, was always by his side, a silent protector, grounding him when the world felt too overwhelming. Over time, Ethan had slowly opened up, his quiet moments now replaced with small conversations. His hands, once trembling and unsteady, now rested at ease on the table as he shared stories of hard-fought battles, both abroad and within himself. Ranger, his steadfast companion, had never left his side, offering the comfort and support that words couldn't. But this morning, things felt different. Olivia watched as Ethan sat at his usual spot, Ranger lying quietly at his feet. The cafe was busy, filled with the hum of regulars catching up over coffee, but there was an undercurrent of tension in the air that Olivia couldn't quite place. It was as if something was about to disrupt the peace, something that would challenge the very foundation of what she had worked so hard to build. Then, like a sudden chill in the air, it happened. "Dogs aren't allowed in here." A voice cut through the calm, sharp and authoritative. "Health violation." The room fell into silence. The sound of coffee being poured, the clinking of cups, everything stopped. Olivia's heart skipped a beat. Ethan's body stiffened, and Olivia immediately recognized the signs. She had seen this before. She knew what was coming. The panic, the discomfort, the way Ethan's hand instinctively tightened around Ranger's harness. The calm exterior was beginning to crack, and in its place was a raw tension, a vulnerability that reminded Olivia of her father's struggles when he came home from his last deployment. The same terror, the same feeling of being trapped. Olivia turned toward the source of the voice. A man stood near the entrance, arms crossed, a smirk playing at the edges of his lips. Roger Mills, the new health inspector. He had a reputation for being difficult, for taking his role as a rule enforcer far too seriously. Olivia had heard whispers of him shutting down businesses for the smallest infractions. But this was different. This wasn't just about rules. This was about treating people with respect, about understanding the needs of those who had given so much. "This is a service dog," Olivia said, her voice firm as she stepped forward. "Under federal ADA law, service animals are allowed in all public spaces." Roger snorted, uncaring. "Law or not, I don't want to see dog hair in people's food," he said dismissively. "Either the dog leaves, or this place gets shut down." A tremor ran through Ethan's hands. Ranger, sensing his distress, moved closer, pressing against him, a silent comfort. The dog's presence was more than just physical. It was grounding Ethan in a world that was suddenly spinning out of control. Olivia clenched her jaw, feeling a surge of protective anger rise within her. This was her cafe, her sanctuary for veterans, and she wasn't going to let anyone tear it down over ignorance or arrogance. She took a deep breath, her voice steady but laced with conviction. "He has the right to be here. Federal law protects service animals." Roger smirked, arms still crossed, unyielding. "I don't care about your so-called rights," he retorted. "Either the dog leaves, or this place is shut down." The silence that followed was suffocating. The usual hum of the cafe, the sound of coffee brewing, the quiet conversations in the background, disappeared. All that was left was the heavy tension between Olivia and Roger, between Ethan and the door. The eyes of the cafe patrons flicked nervously between them, unsure of what would happen next, waiting for someone to back down. Ethan's fingers twitched against Ranger's harness, his breath shallow. The dog let out a low whimper, a sound that wasn't aggressive, but one that conveyed a deep sense of concern, of unease. It was enough to remind Ethan that he wasn't alone. Ranger was there, as always, to steady him in his most fragile moments. Olivia felt her heart pounding in her chest, her fists clenching at her sides. She couldn't let this happen. She couldn't let another veteran, another person who had fought for this country, be treated like they didn't matter, like they weren't worthy of respect. She had seen what it had done to her father, how he had been treated when he came home, how the world seemed to forget him, to push him aside. She wouldn't let that happen to Ethan. Not here, not now. My father was a Marine, Olivia said, her voice even but filled with a quiet strength. I grew up knowing what veterans go through. I won't stand here and let you treat them like they don't belong. Roger's lips curled in amusement, unfazed. Then don't stand here, he sneered. Olivia felt the weight of his words like a blow. She stood tall, staring him down, but just as she was about to respond, the sharp, authoritative voice of her district manager cut through the tension. Olivia, stop. She turned, her heart sinking as she saw the look on his face, a mixture of panic, desperation, and fear. It wasn't for Ethan or the veterans. It was for the cafe, for the business. The bottom line. I can't do anything about this, he said, his voice shaking. Roger has the authority. If we fight, this place gets shut down. You're forcing my hand. The words that followed crushed Olivia. You're fired. Standing alone. The words hung in the air like a punch to the gut. And Olivia stood frozen, her heart beating wildly in her chest. You're fired. The words echoed in her mind, over and over, as though they were trapped inside her skull, refusing to leave. She felt like the world had just shifted beneath her feet, and she was being left behind, dangling at the edge of everything she had worked so hard for. Her eyes darted to her district manager, who seemed to shrink before her. His face was pale, his shoulders hunched in defeat, but it wasn't about him. It wasn't about the business or the rules he was so desperately trying to protect. No, it was about something far more important, something that transcended any job, any paycheck, any career. It was about standing up for what was right. Olivia's gaze shifted to Ethan, who was still seated at the table, his eyes locked on her, his expression unreadable. She could see the slight tremor in his hands, the anxiety bubbling just beneath the surface. The dog, Ranger, stood silently at his side, its body tense, eyes never leaving Ethan, as if it understood the situation in a way no one else could. Ranger's loyalty, unwavering, reminded Olivia of the kind of person Ethan was. Someone who had fought for this country, for people like her, and who now sat here, being treated like an inconvenience. Olivia's breath hitched in her throat as the weight of the moment settled into her bones. She hadn't just lost her job. She had lost her place in a community that she had spent years building. A place where veterans, people like Ethan, could come for some semblance of peace and safety. And now she was being told that her stand for what was right was no longer worth the price of keeping her job. The silence in the cafe was deafening. Every eye was on her. Olivia's hands clenched into fists at her sides. The shame, the pressure, all of it wanted to push her down, to force her into submission, but she wouldn't allow it. She had seen her father, a decorated Marine, struggle with the invisible wounds of war. She had seen the fear, the frustration, and the isolation that came with being a veteran. She wasn't about to let that same fear, that same struggle, happen to Ethan in this very place. Olivia stepped forward, her chin raised, her resolve hardening. I'm not backing down, she said, her voice steady but filled with conviction. You won't do this. You can't treat people like this, not in my cafe. She felt the eyes of the room on her, and for a split second, the weight of the moment made her doubt herself. Was she doing the right thing? Was she about to lose everything? But then she looked at Ethan, at Ranger, and all the doubts faded. She couldn't let fear control her now. Not when someone like Ethan, someone who had fought for this country, needed her to be strong. The district manager didn't meet her gaze. He kept his eyes lowered, avoiding the confrontation. "Olivia, I don't have a choice. You forced my hand. I've already told you." His voice faltered, but the decision had been made, and he was too afraid to do anything about it. He was trapped in the same system that Olivia had spent years trying to navigate. It wasn't about the veterans. It was about business, bottom lines, and profits. Olivia pulled her apron off with a sharp tug, the fabric heavy with 6 years of memories, of early mornings, long shifts, laughter shared with the regulars, of Ethan's slow transformation from a man lost in silence to one finding his voice. She could feel the weight of every memory as she pulled the apron free, each second slipping away, disappearing with the small threads of fabric. Her heart ached as she looked around the cafe. This place had been her life. And now, just like that, it was gone. She turned to Ethan. His face was pale, his expression unreadable, but she could see the storm inside him. The doubt, the spiraling thoughts, the self-loathing that often haunted those who had been left behind. The very same thoughts her father used to have. Maybe I am a burden. Maybe they really don't care about me. Ethan's silence screamed. She couldn't let him feel that. She wouldn't. "Ethan," she said, her voice soft but firm, her words cutting through the thick silence. "This is not your fault." She moved toward him, her hand reaching out to touch his shoulder gently. "You belong here. You always will. Never forget that." Ranger's ears perked up, and the dog nudged Ethan's leg, its eyes full of understanding and warmth. It was as if the dog, too, was trying to reassure Ethan that he wasn't alone. The two of them, Ethan and Ranger, had a bond that nothing could break. Not now, not ever. Olivia stood there for a moment longer, taking in the weight of her words. She saw Ethan blink, his eyes filled with gratitude and confusion. He was processing what was happening, just as Olivia was. But in that moment, all she could do was stand there, offering him the only thing she could give, hope. And in return, she would carry that same hope with her as she stepped away from the only job she'd ever loved. With a deep breath, she grabbed her bag from behind the counter, feeling every step of the walk toward the door. Each step felt heavier than the last, like a burden she had never anticipated. She reached for the door handle, her fingers trembling, and pushed open the door. The brisk morning air hit her face, sharp and cold, but it felt like a slap to the face, waking her up to the reality of what had just happened. She was free, but she was also standing at the edge of something uncertain, something she had no control over. The world outside seemed to keep moving, unaware that Olivia's life had just changed forever. She didn't know what the future held, didn't know how she would make ends meet, or what the next chapter of her life would look like. But she knew one thing: she had done the right thing. And in the end, that was all that mattered. A turning point. Olivia stood in the parking lot, her car parked in front of her, its engine still cold and silent. The weight of what had just happened pressed down on her chest, each breath more difficult than the last. She had just lost the only job she had ever truly cared about, the job that had given her a sense of purpose and a connection to the veterans who came into her cafe. She looked at the crisp morning sky, her mind still racing. What was she supposed to do now? She had no backup plan, no safety net, and with the rent due next week, the weight of reality came crashing in. A small part of her wanted to cry, to let the floodgates open and let the emotions pour out. But something inside her refused. She had always been taught to stand tall, to persevere even in the face of adversity. Her father, a Marine who had fought battles of his own, both on the front lines and at home, had instilled in her the importance of doing what was right, no matter the cost. As she gripped the steering wheel, trying to push the panic down, a strange rumble interrupted her thoughts. It wasn't the usual sound of passing cars or the hum of the morning traffic. No, this was different. The vibration in the ground was distinct, steady, like the deep rumble of engines getting closer. Olivia's head snapped up. The low hum grew louder and louder, vibrations in the air reaching her like a wave. Confusion flooded her mind. Was it the sound of military vehicles? Her heart raced. She hadn't seen anything like this before. Not here. The town was small, quiet, hardly the place for a military convoy. But the vibrations were undeniable. She hesitated, staring at her phone, thinking it might be another call from her district manager or an angry client. But the buzzing had stopped. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself as she stepped out of the car and walked toward the noise. And then she saw them. At first, there was a figure at the far end of the parking lot. But then another, and another. Before she could even process what was happening, the entire parking lot was filled with uniformed Marines. Dozens of them, standing at attention, like statues. Their boots planted firmly on the asphalt, their eyes sharp, their faces focused. They exuded a presence that was impossible to ignore. They were serious, disciplined, unwavering. Olivia stopped in her tracks, breath catching in her throat. It felt like the earth had shifted under her feet again, only this time, it was different. The ground beneath her seemed to hum with power and intent. The Marines were here for a reason, and somehow, in the pit of her stomach, Olivia knew that this wasn't just a coincidence. This wasn't some random military demonstration or drill. This was something much bigger. The commanding officer, Colonel Nathan Pierce, stepped forward. Olivia's eyes locked onto him, and a chill ran down her spine. She knew him, or at least she recognized him. He had been her father's commanding officer during his last deployment, one of the few men who had truly understood the sacrifices her father had made. She had heard stories about him. The kind of officer who had commanded respect and admiration, a man who carried his rank with integrity and strength. But this was different. This man, this colonel, wasn't just a military figure in her past. He was here, in the present, standing right in front of her. Olivia felt a sudden jolt of recognition. The weight of everything she had just endured, the loss, the shock, the fear, began to feel strangely insignificant in the face of this new reality. There were no words, no thoughts, just the overwhelming presence of this man, walking toward her like a force of nature. The other Marines remained still, like statues, watching her every move. As Colonel Pierce approached, the atmosphere seemed to thicken, charged with an unspoken tension. Olivia's heart raced, her breath shallow. She hadn't expected this. Not in a million years. Olivia Harper, Colonel Pierce's voice was steady, deep, and authoritative. He wasn't asking a question, but stating a fact. He already knew who she was. Her eyes widened as he stopped in front of her. "Yes," she managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've been looking for you," he continued, his eyes steady, but there was a softness in his expression that didn't belong to the hardened military officer she had imagined. "We've all been looking for you." Her confusion must have been obvious, because Colonel Pierce smiled slightly, a faint, knowing smile that made her heart skip. Behind him, the Marines remained as they were, silently waiting for something. For what? She wasn't sure. But the power in the air, the stillness of the moment, told her this was more than just a group of Marines showing up on a whim. They had a purpose. "You stood up for the right people, Olivia," Colonel Pierce said, nodding toward the cafe. "Do you know what happens when you do that?" She shook her head slowly, not sure what to say. Her entire world was spinning out of control, and she had no idea how to navigate this new reality. "You find out who's willing to stand up for you," he continued, his voice steady, but there was something else beneath the words. Something deeper, like a bond that had always existed, but she hadn't known about. Just as Olivia was about to respond, a voice called her name. "Olivia." She turned, and there was Ethan, standing near the entrance of the cafe. His face was etched with uncertainty, but there was something else there. Something more. His hand rested on Ranger's harness, and as the dog leaned in closer, Olivia realized that in this moment she wasn't alone. Neither was Ethan. And neither were the veterans who had come to the cafe looking for hope. "Don't worry," Colonel Pierce said, his voice calm but filled with authority. "You're not alone. We're all in this together." Olivia blinked, her mind racing. What had she gotten herself into? And why did she suddenly feel like she had just become part of something much larger than herself? Before she could speak, Colonel Pierce turned, his gaze sweeping over the Marines behind him. He gave a small nod. "Marines," he said, his voice ringing out. "Let's show her what happens when someone stands up for the right thing." A new dawn. The parking lot seemed frozen in time as Colonel Pierce's words echoed in Olivia's ears. Her heart was still racing, unsure of what exactly was happening. The Marines stood silently in perfect formation, a powerful, unwavering presence. Olivia was caught between confusion and something much stronger, hope. The weight of her loss, the shock of being fired, and the sense of betrayal were still heavy on her shoulders. But in that moment, something began to shift. She wasn't alone. She had a sense of belonging she hadn't felt in years. Colonel Pierce stepped toward her again, this time his expression softer, almost reassuring. "Olivia," he said gently, "you've done something remarkable today. You've stood up for veterans, for something bigger than yourself. You've shown more courage than most people ever will." Olivia's breath hitched. Courage. The word felt like a lifeline, like something she had been searching for in the midst of all her fears. Her mind raced, but she couldn't ignore the truth of what was unfolding before her. The Marines, led by Colonel Pierce, had come not just to acknowledge her actions, but to show her something she had long forgotten: the value of standing up for what was right, no matter the cost. "We know what it's like," Pierce continued, his voice steady, "to fight for something bigger than ourselves. And now, it's our turn to fight for you." As he spoke those words, a sense of calm washed over Olivia. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, she wasn't fighting a battle alone. She could feel the solidarity, the understanding that had been missing from her life for so long. These men, these Marines, weren't just a symbol of authority. They were a symbol of something deeper, something much more meaningful. Loyalty, duty, and the willingness to stand up for others, even when it seemed impossible. As Colonel Pierce extended his hand again, this time Olivia took it without hesitation. His grip was firm, but it was also comforting. A silent promise that this moment wasn't just a fluke, it was a turning point. She could feel her breath steady as she looked into his eyes. There was no judgment there, no hesitation, only a deep understanding of what it meant to fight for what's right. "You're not alone in this, Olivia," he said, his voice low but filled with the weight of conviction. "We're here, not just to support you, but to ensure that the world knows what happens when someone like you steps forward. We stand with you." Her heart swelled, and for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to believe in the power of standing up for what was right. It wasn't about the job she had lost. It wasn't about the financial uncertainty that loomed over her future. It was about something much greater, a deeper sense of purpose, of meaning, that she had nearly forgotten in the rush of daily life. "Thank you," Olivia whispered, her voice breaking through the stillness. I don't know what to say." Colonel Pierce gave a small, understanding smile. "There's no need to say anything. Just know that we've got your back." With that, he turned and signaled the Marines to follow him. But as they began to move, the sense of calm and certainty lingered in the air, like a promise made that would never be broken. Olivia stood there, watching them go, her mind still racing, but her heart lighter than it had been in days. As the Marines drove off, their vehicles disappearing into the distance, Olivia took a deep breath and turned back toward the cafe. The building that had once been a place of solace for so many now felt different. It wasn't just a cafe anymore. It was a symbol of something bigger than herself. It was a place where people stood up for what was right, even when the world seemed to be stacked against them. Ethan, who had been standing quietly near the door the entire time, walked toward her, his eyes filled with gratitude and something else. understanding. "Thank you," he said, his voice soft, but heavy with emotion. Ranger, his loyal service dog, stood by his side, tail wagging gently as if sensing the shift in the air. "You don't have to thank me," Olivia said, smiling through the tears that threatened to spill over. "It's the least I could do. You and all the veterans who come here, you're the ones who taught me what it means to fight for something bigger than myself. Today, I just did what I had to do." Ethan nodded, his eyes lingering on her for a moment longer. "You're a good person, Olivia. You've given me more than just coffee and a place to sit. You've given me hope. And today, you showed me that I'm not alone in this." Olivia's heart swelled with a feeling she couldn't quite explain. It was a mixture of pride, relief, and love. A deep, profound understanding that sometimes, even in the darkest moments, we find the strength to do what's right. And in doing so, we not only change our lives, but the lives of others as well. As they walked back into the cafe, the morning light seemed brighter, more welcoming. The cafe was still there, still standing, but something had shifted. Olivia knew this was the beginning of something new. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for sure. She would keep fighting for what was right, no matter the cost. The door to the cafe opened, and a few regulars trickled in, some of them offering nods of recognition. It was a new day, and Olivia, with Ethan and Ranger by her side, had found her purpose once again. This concludes the story. Thank you for watching until the end. I hope you found it enjoyable. If you did, please consider liking the video and sharing it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and activate the notification bell for more captivating stories. Have a great day.